I want to invite a conversation around the teacher-student relationship. And maybe start by asking you if you could describe what makes a healthy teacher-student relationship in a Vajrayana practice context.
For my students, for me to create a healthy relationship, it has to do with so much of my own interests. Like, I'm very interested in psychology, and I'm very interested in creating communities that are safe for survivors. So for me, a safe community has to do with spaces where there's a kind of autonomy for students and intellectual freedom. And I see myself like as an educator, relating to them as an educator, and trying to be like a safe person who can offer another perspective, but is still just a person. So these are some of the things that I think about, like spaces that are where there's room for like the intense care that we can develop between teachers and students, but also there's room to acknowledge the limits and room for like questions and boundaries, and where there's like space for that. And for me, I love learning above all else, and I feel like for students to learn, like really learn and grow, like explore reality, they need that kind of room.
You're describing a situation where the individual teacher, in this case yourself, is deciding where to set the level of entrusting or dependence, or as you're describing it, control. But there's certainly a normative discourse that encourages people to see the guru as a Buddha, to trust that the guru always does have far greater wisdom than ourselves, and to avail oneself of that wisdom. And so, we are in a tradition where that does take place a great deal. How do you reconcile those sorts of discourses with this approach of opening up to personal style?
I think that texts are one thing, but lived realities are another. And that in lived realities, Buddhists, have all kinds of levels of difference in how much they follow their teacher's instructions, when they question them, when they're able to follow them. So I would like promote a more expansive view that looks at the diversity of how teachers and students function in the tradition. Like for me, I'm a scholar, so it affects how I teach, and it affects what I teach and the kind of community that I'm going to have. Likewise, this has been the case all throughout Tibetan Buddhist history. There are many different types of teachers and teacher-student relationships. I was just teaching like on the 6 yogas, for example, like Khyongpo Naljor, who has his relationship with his teacher in dreams. So I wonder if, there is like a more orthodox interpretation of texts that tell us like to see this way. And then there's the diversity of lived realities, which are very much dependent on the style of the teacher, the circumstances, the amount of contact, and the kind of intense like hermeneutics, the interpretive aspect of Buddhism that yields all these diverse ways. I talk about sexual abuse and abuse in my communities. This isn't something that we're quiet about. And, we haven't had a huge scandal in our community, but I talk about these things. And I think it's because of the feminist values at the core of my own work and my own life, that we talk about abuse. We talk about what is it to be empowered and to be responsible for oneself and to be safe in community. And also I teach about like the history of Buddhist sexualities in ways that raise questions rather than saying that there's like one dogmatic way, and talk about the dangers. And I think that's happening because of my own feminism. And, I became Buddhist and a feminist at the same time when I was a young girl. So
how is it that you teach sexual ethics in a way that is conducive to creating safe spaces and communities?
yeah, this is a huge concern I have. When I was a little girl, my first Buddhist teacher, when I was 5, as I was growing up, he would say to me, there's, a lot of the teachers are abusers. You have to watch out for the translators. So he was warning me about sexual abuse. And also that made me aware that it didn't have to be that way, right? He wasn't abusive towards me, and I was safe with him and his wife. And so I really believe that education is important. One of the problems that happens with sexual abuse is like trying to make sense of the grooming, the coercion that happens. And we know now that community members are saying, oh, well, it's your teacher, this is, and they themselves are thinking, oh, is this devotion? And of course, I have to say yes to my teacher. There's a huge gap in knowledge about sexuality in the Buddhist context. And I ended up having to read a lot of historical materials about Buddhist sexualities for my scholarly work in Dzogchen, because I wanted to write about women in 14th century classical great perfection, Dzogchen. And a lot of the texts that talk about women were talking about women as consorts. So I spent a lot of time learning about Buddhist sexualities and the history of Buddhist sexualities. And so these kind of circumstances, the feeling of really wanting it to be a different way and also being aware of the history, came up with kind of resulted in me having this approach. So every year I do something educational around Buddhist sexualities. And my goal is that if someone comes to a Dharma teaching even one time and they never see me again, that I've somehow given them some awareness about this. But then also once a year, I spend time like with my community. For example, last year we had a class on grooming. What is grooming and how does it show up in a Buddhist context? Like grooming is so insidious because behaviors that are grooming can also not be grooming. So, really recognizing what grooming is, but also being aware, that in these situations are very ambiguous and one has to be proactive. And the year before that, it was a history of Buddhist sexualities. The year before that, every time there was a case that comes up, I do a Buddhist response to the case. When there's an allegation that arises, I go over the allegation, I talk about Buddhist responses and the community dialogues about it. So I've really felt like education is super important because there's so much of a gap there and trying to make sense of what's happening. But these struggles over Buddhist sexual ethics have a long history, a 2,500-year history. And it's good for us to have those resources to know what texts say and what other teachers said. And, like it's very interesting. Like, for example, the Edict of Lama Yeshe, where in the 11th century, where he says like, oh, these people are pretending that they're practicing Tantra, but it's like a jackal in a wolf's clothing. They've forgotten Mahayana. They've forgotten, compassion. And so hearing the critiques that Buddhists have had over the breaches of, sexual ethics, I think is really important, and creating the space where students can be exposed to all the different perspectives that there are. And also, like, then one other thing, which is that, I'm a yogini, I'm not a nun. So my tradition, the lineage that I come from is a lineage where it's householders, married practitioners who had families. And so my students are not celibate and they're going to be in sexual relationships. And so I do want them to think both about the dangers of sexual misconduct, but also like what are sexual ethics in terms of appropriately like caring for beings, like not increasing the suffering in the world through one's own decisions about sexuality, but instead minimizing harm and maximizing the liberation of oneself and others through care, through respect, through empathy, through paying attention, and so forth. So yeah, I don't know. That was a long answer, but it basically, like, I think the main thing is I got into this whole like approach of really being proactive, because my own teacher told me from a young age, like, you have to be aware that this is out there. And so I also do this with my students.
So since
Yeah.
the aim of this conversation is itself educational, I wonder if we could go back and you could share some of the grooming behaviors that might or might not be grooming, because that, I think, is an area where a lot of, the hermeneutic richness and the confusion can enter in.
Yes, I would love to. So knowing about grooming is really important because we often wonder, like, why do women stay in relationships where there's physical violence? Or people might say, like, oh, that would never happen to me. I would never get in a situation like in a relationship like that with someone who's abusing me. But the reality is that it could happen to anyone. It could happen to anyone. It isn't happening to those people because something's wrong with them. It's happening to them because grooming is extremely effective. And yes, it is true that people who have a history of abuse are more likely to get abused again because they don't see the red flags and respond to them. They're used to having their boundaries violated. And so they're less assertive when those violations start to pile up again. That is true. But someone doesn't need a history of abuse to get abused for the first time. And why that can happen to anyone listening, this may have happened already to you, and it may happen in the future, is because grooming is incredibly effective. And by grooming, I refer to a set of behaviors that teach oneself not to have boundaries. And for example, they can be very insidious. So if you go into a Vajrayana community and you're brand new in that community, and then a senior student who's been in that community for a long time comes and gives you all this amazing attention and compliments and says, like, oh, wow, I just, you have so much potential. I could really see, one day you could be in the seat that I'm sitting in, or something like this. Why is a person who has that much more power and authority than you giving you such a huge compliment? You have to ask why. What's going on there? When that happens, when someone with more power and authority is giving you a lot of attention, is showering you with compliments, this is a one way that they begin to get you to let your guard down. And they may not be doing this in a malicious way. They are not thinking, I want to abuse you in the future. But instead, they may be intensely attracted to you. And they're like in this state of, a physiological state. There's a lot of biochemistry happening where they are trying to unwittingly, also get the love and connection that they're longing for, that they are totally blind and ignoring the power difference. They may be thinking of you only in terms of their own joy or pleasure and not like as a person. Like, so much is happening. But that could be a grooming behavior. So one example of grooming is when someone with more power than you gives you privileges, attention, compliments, and you have to really ask yourself why that's happening. It doesn't always end up in abuse, right? But it creates a space where you begin to let your guard down. Another thing is that they can do minor violations of boundaries, like touching you, like touch hand on your back, for example, right? That's not necessarily sexual touch, but it's now normalizing that it's okay for them to touch your body. But why is someone with more power and authority than you, like, just deciding to touch your body without asking, without getting your permission? It creates a space where one gets used to being touched, like that one doesn't have to say yes or no. So that's a grooming behavior. Another example of a grooming behavior are situations where the lack of boundaries are celebrated. Like I've seen in some groups, oh, well, you're just being governed by your attachments and aversions. You need to drop your attachments and aversions and go along with what the teacher says, which is maybe something outlandish. And the best practitioners are those with these supple minds who can drop their attachments and aversions and do, what's being asked, right? So here it's grooming because it's training you that when you have a negative response, a negative feeling, that's not okay. That's now fallen into this category of mental afflictions, and you're not supposed to have it. You're supposed to want whatever they want. So all on their own, like any one of these things could be minor, but stacking them up, one is gradually learning not to respond, not to consent to touch. One is like becoming addicted to the attention and privileges that are being showered upon oneself for not having boundaries. And gradually, as the way that grooming works is that by the time, the abuse happens, that's after hundreds of violations. That's it happened, it was starting a long time ago. Before the actual abuse, there was other things, the secrets that were kept, the things you couldn't say no to, right? So when I teach about grooming, it's about being aware and asking, like, why is this happening? Because sometimes it's not for abuse, right? That could be a lot of love and attention just being showered on you. Someone could touch your back because they, they have different boundaries around touch than you do, right? You might be asked, like, to drop your attachments and aversions, right? And it actually not end up being an abusive situation. The thing about grooming is you just don't really know what's going on, but you can start to ask, like, why is this happening? And have a very heightened awareness. And it's really important in spiritual groups to say no, to not go along with everything. It's part of how you get to know a teacher. You want to see what they're, just like in a relationship, any relationship, you need to know how they are when you say no. You need to see how the community is when you're not available. It is okay to experiment with that and just set those boundaries, put them up, put them down, and see what happens. So that's just some examples of grooming, from Vajrayana situations. Yes. Oh, well, I wish I could say more. I feel inadequate because I think grooming is really insidious. I wish I had more examples, because a lot of things that people don't think are grooming, like, oh, here's an example. For example, like, your teacher just shows up without making an appointment. Like, why are they doing that? Why are you expected to be available or ready anytime? Now suddenly you're being trained, right? I'm always available for this person. So the grooming can be so many little things, but they all add up. It creates a context where one isn't saying no, isn't saying boundaries, is no longer like in the space of checking, like, oh, do I want to do this or not? It's been taken away through all the acts of grooming.
So what you're describing when you're describing these different grooming situations, in many of the cases that you've just mentioned, there's community participation. There's not just one person, one predator grooming someone, preparing them to have their boundaries crossed. The whole community is encouraging and condoning in some of these situations. So I wonder if you could just share maybe some final thoughts on what communities need to be attentive to in order to ensure that they are not participating in behaviors that end up leaving people vulnerable to abuse, but instead create truly safe spaces.
I love this question to ask, like, what communities can do, because that is a huge part of it. Is the community is not a passive bystander. The communities are part of the dynamics that enable these behaviors. And most of what I've seen has been after the fact that communities look back, community members, and they realize they were part of this. And, they feel like the remorse and bewilderment that happens when an allegation comes out and they find out what's been happening. And they realize that this environment of devotion and obedience and solidarity was actually enabling an abuser. And that can be really painful to find out afterwards. So I like what your question is, like, what could you do in advance? Like, what about being a safe community member? I think one thing is recognizing that there's more than one way to practice the Dharma. That's number one. There isn't just one right way to be a good Buddhist. There never has been. Buddhists have disagreed on everything from what is emptiness to what is enlightenment. There are different ideas of enlightenment in the different philosophical vehicles. And so Buddhism hasn't been a monoculture where there's one right way to be a student, one right way to be a teacher, one right way to be in community, one right way to do a practice. Quite the opposite. There's been many ways. And I think creating hospitality towards people in the community who do things differently than you is really important. And there could be reasons. There could be reasons someone doesn't want to come in and bow. It's not just because, there's some kind of bull in a china shop, right? They're not necessarily just ignoring etiquette. Maybe that person's a survivor and they're trying to figure out their relationship to Buddhism and bowing feels wrong. Or, maybe someone in the community who's new and you don't even know what their backstory is, like, may come in and decide, like, I'm not going to do the program as it's set out, right? Every Dharma school has these programs, a sequence of things that one does. And that doesn't mean they're less of a competent Dharma practitioner. There are many different ways to engage. And, this is not a caravan of despair. Buddhism is here to serve people and help people, and they will have to take it the way that they take it. And so I think that's an important thing, is to allow that heterogeneity within the community, because you're going to have people who need to do things different for important ways. And I think we're losing that in American culture, is tolerance of dissent. And that's a really bad thing that's happening. And we shouldn't lose that in Buddhist cultures, because dissent, debate, vigorous inspection of reality, this is what is Buddhism. And so to allow that, I think, is one way to create a safe community. And then another way is that if someone tells you something, to really make space to believe them, or even if you don't believe them right away, to allow yourself to consider that what they're saying is true if they tell you an allegation of abuse. And what happens oftentimes is community members will say, but I never saw that. I never saw them do that. And I want you to know that's common in abusive situations, that they abuse one person or abuse in secret behind closed doors, and not everyone sees it. So whether you saw it or not doesn't mean it didn't happen. So to create a safe community is also to believe people when they give the allegations, or at least just make the space to try and understand, from their perspective, what happened. And then also to create safe community, I think, is to explore these edges between like devotion and boundaries oneself, and not sort of think that's other people's work to do. Like, I don't have those issues, so that's not my work to do. But instead to realize, like, we're all creating cultures together, Buddhist cultures, and each person is a node in that creation. We're shaping it and being shaped by it. And so oneself to really do that work of figuring out what one's own boundaries around time, and boundaries of with one's body, and the boundaries like of allowing disbelief and critical thinking. Like, I think that's an important thing, because being a good Buddhist doesn't mean believing everything your teacher says, right? That there's a lot of stories about this in Buddhism. Like, they liken that to a bird, like a parrot, I guess is what we would say, who just can repeat everything the teacher says. That's not what we're looking for. So then what happens when your teacher says something that doesn't make sense to you? What are you going to do with that? And to be conscious of, there are going to be those times. There definitely will be. That's why the texts have to repeat over and over again to follow the teacher, because hardly anyone can. It's really hard. It's really hard to keep vows. It's very hard to follow the teacher's instructions. It's hard to do practices. And so when those moments come, how are you going to deal with it? I always say those are great moments for debate, discussion, questions. So you can foster environments like that where questions are asked, where doubts are okay. Yeah, so I would say those three examples to making a safe community of like asking the doubts and questions, being someone who believes others. And then I forgot, what was my first one? I don't know, but that one as well.
Yeah, I had it in my mind and it also slipped into the next one.
Yeah.
It's a little bit
Yeah.
late here.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And also too, I want to say, like, one of the things we know about abuse is that it's everywhere. So you could do everything right as a community member, and then it happens like this. We have to recognize the pervasiveness of violence, especially, violence towards women. We know it's more likely towards women. We're also seeing from the research that younger women in Vajrayana communities are more vulnerable. Also, like violence towards women of color is even more prevalent. That this takes place. We're not swimming even here in this kind of space that we're creating awareness about this situation. There's no place where we don't have to be careful, and there's no level that we don't have to be careful. I remember Longchenpa in the Sigdonze, the Treasury of Words and Meanings. Longchenpa is a famous 14th century master of esoteric Buddhist philosophy. And he writes this text that talks about all the stages of the path towards full Buddhahood. And at the most advanced stages, he says, then if you slip back here, this is what you should do. And we should remember that. Like, we could always slip back. We could always become confused. There could always be violence and abuse around us, or misconduct. There's never a place where we don't need awareness and discrimination and carefulness. That's the whole teaching of karma. Every act matters, every thought matters. And so that the keenness of our presence and our attention, it never can fail. It always has to be there. We don't get to some level on the path where now everything's going to be okay and we don't have to make decisions and can just sort of check out. No, we have to work with circumstances, adjust, be aware, pay attention to the teachings, inspect our own interpretation of the teachings, re-inspect them again. That's what it is to live a life of practice. So I hope that there will be a sense of carefulness that maybe could be one of the answers to the last question as well. We have to be careful, very, very careful, not to harm people, not to enable harm. That's a kind of carefulness that we must live by.
I've learned so much in this conversation.
Thank you. That's so kind. Well, I mean, a lot of these things are just the things that I experiment within my own community, but I know like I learned so much from what you're doing, and I really look to see like what will emerge in Dharma communities of the future as we take into account the safety of our community members in this way.
Well, I count myself very fortunate to have you as a Dharma sister walking along this unknown and beautiful path.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me.